be taking questions from two fixed microphones and so forth? Okay.
It's all right, fine. Question and answer part is usually the best part of a talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Athenaeum's movable feast this evening, and welcome also to the opening event of the Henry Salvatori Center's 25th anniversary conference. The first of CMC's research institutes, the Salvatori Center was born of Mr. Salvatori's concern for the fate of freedom in the modern world, a concern arising from his extensive reading and from the manifold experiences, the adventures, really, of his own remarkable life. Born in Italy in 1901, he immigrated to America with his family in 1906, studied at the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia, and in 1933, not an auspicious year for most businesses, started his own company, Western Geophysical Corporation, which quickly became the industry leader in seismic methods of exploring for oil. In 1960, he sold his company and began a second career as a philanthropist and political activist. A dedicated anti-communist who was active in Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, Salvatori soon became the leader of the small group of men, the so-called kitchen cabinet, who encouraged Ronald Reagan to enter politics and helped organize his first campaign for governor in 1966. But Salvatori was concerned not only with the communist threat to the free world, but also with the long-range and more fundamental problem of the sense of purpose or internal cohesion of the West itself, particularly the United States. With this in mind, he founded the Salvatori Center at CMC to study the moral and intellectual foundations of civil society, the conditions, economic, religious, cultural, legal, political, that help to make freedom salutary and enduring. I'm Charles Kessler, the director of the Salvatori Center, and today we're gathered to celebrate the Center's silver anniversary. And what better way to do so than to revisit our original and overarching concern with the problem of modern freedom. To canvass the many dimensions of this problem, we have invited to CMC a distinguished group of scholars who have in one way or another been associated with the center over the past quarter century. Tomorrow we will hold two panels in Davidson Lecture Hall beginning at 1:30 p.m. and on Saturday two more beginning at 9:30 a.m. devoted to debating salient aspects of individual freedom in the modern world. These panels are open to the public and I invite you all to come. I say debating because there is, in fact, much to dispute about modern freedom. And I expect that our panelists will have thoughtful, in some cases sharp, disagreements about it. Even on the most basic questions, what is modern freedom, as opposed to ancient, traditional, Christian, or postmodern freedom, there is plenty of room for dispute. And is modern freedom a good thing? Here, too, there will be controversy. Modern liberty embraces scientific and technological progress, artistic self-expression, free enterprise, religious free exercise, political self-government, among other elements. At what point do these liberties conflict or cross over into license? That's not easy to say, though it may be essential to determine. And thus no discussion of freedom is possible without raising the sometimes competing claims of order, virtue, tradition, and natural right. The point was well captured by Edmund Burke, who presciently observed in 1790 that the effect of liberty to individuals is that they may do what they please. We ought to see what it will please them to do before we risk congratulations. Of course, it was Burke who lamented the passing of the age of chivalry and the arrival of the modern age of what he called sophisters, economists, and calculators. Milton Friedman must plead guilty to one count of this indictment. He is an economist. Indeed, he is perhaps the best-known living American economist. But his passionate love of liberty has never been calculating. and his vast learning and scrupulous sense of intellectual fair play are far removed from sophistry. During his long career at the University of Chicago and later at the Hoover Institution, he refined the doctrines of monetary economics in a series of stunning articles and books, applied those doctrines to the history of the business cycle in America in his important A Monetary History of the United States with Anna Schwartz. And he preached the good news of individual liberty to millions through his column in Newsweek, his immensely readable books on public policy, written with his wife, Rose Friedman, who's with us tonight, and his 2 television series, Free to Choose and Tyranny of the Status Quo. In 1976, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Excellence in Economics. And in 1988, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian accolade by President Ronald Reagan. Some 25 years ago, Milton Friedman was present at the first charter conference held by the Salvatore Center. So it is with special pride that we welcome him back to Claremont on this happy anniversary and invite him to launch our deliberations with his remarks tonight on free markets and free men. Ladies and gentlemen, Milton Friedman.
Thank you, Charles, for that introduction. I may say I'm delighted to be here under the auspices of the Salvatore Center. As Charles said, I was here at the first one of your conferences before you were, but also it's more than that. Sometime in the late 60s or early 70s, I forget which, I spent a quarter as a visiting professor at the University of California of Los Angeles. And one of the high spots of that quarter was meeting Henry Salvatore. It was Henry Salvatore who, in turn, put me in touch with Ronald Reagan and introduced me to Ronald Reagan. So I have a very personal reason to feel very favorably toward Henry Salvatore and toward the Salvatore Center. Some 30-odd years ago, my wife and I published a book called Capitalism and Freedom, which was devoted to the question of the relationship between those two. And in that book, I wrote, and I quote, "Historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity." We went on to point out that history suggests only that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. Clearly, it is not a sufficient condition. Now, those two statements remain valid today. It is still true that I do not know of any country that has had a large degree of political freedom, however you define it, that has not also relied primarily on free markets to organize their economic activity. And it's also clearly true there have been many countries that were not free, that relied on markets and private activity to organize economics. Ancient Greece is an example. Ancient Greece relied essentially on markets, but it also had slaves. The South of the United States is an example. Before the Civil War, it also relied primarily on markets to organize its economic activity, but it also had slaves. There are many other examples. Portugal under Salazar, Chile under Pinochet, under Pinochet. In both cases, society was organized largely in a capitalist free market way, and yet you did not have freedom of the citizens to vote for their government. However, and that's what I really want to talk about tonight, experience since we wrote that has persuaded me that our analysis in that book was much too simple I do not think that you can use a simple dichotomy of economic freedom and political freedom. I think you have to at least, even at the most abstract level, consider a trichotomy: economic freedom, human freedom, and political freedom. Where I define political freedom for this purpose in the straightforward way of political freedom means the freedom of the citizens to vote for who governs them, to vote for their governors. Human freedom, by that I mean what we all intend by it: freedom to speak, the freedom to write, the freedom of press, the freedom of religion, the well-known freedoms of that kind. In Capitalism and Freedom, I implicitly define political freedom more broadly, to include human or civil freedom. I now believe that was a mistake, that it's much better to define political freedom narrowly and to keep the human freedom separate. The example, in my experience, that really brought home to me the oversimplification of the analysis we had in Capitalism and Freedom is Hong Kong. And I want to talk some about Hong Kong because I think it's an example that has a great deal to offer to students of freedom. As you all know, Hong Kong is unquestionably the freest economy in the world, as of now. It won't be a year from now. It's a great tragedy that this great example for scholars and for people in general is going to disappear a year from now when China takes over. But that's a separate point, and I'll leave that to one side. Hong Kong has almost complete economic freedom. There are no tariffs, no subsidies to exports, very limited government intervention. There are some government regulations about which side of the street you have to drive on and other similar things like that. Some government intervention because of the early problems of the streams of refugees who came from China. Government inevitably got involved in providing some housing, and there is government intervention in housing. But taxes are low. The tax rate is, average tax rate on individual incomes is limited to 15%. Total government spending is relatively small. In every dimension you can look at, it comes closer than any other country in the world today to having a completely free economy. It also has, in my experience, complete human freedom. I have been in Hong Kong many times. I have never encountered any unwillingness of people to speak freely, to talk freely, to meet freely until recent years, when the threat of China has had an effect. There's been freedom of press, freedom of religion. It's had complete human freedom. And yet it has had absolutely no political freedom. The last few years may seem an exception when something called LegCo, Legislative Council, was established, in which the citizens of Hong Kong were able to vote for representatives. But I must say, I regard that as something of a Potemkin monument to political freedom. It's constructed for show, not use. It was constructed to show the Chinese that the British were serious about the people having something to say. Prior to that, there was no involvement whatsoever. Hong Kong, in political terms, Hong Kong has been a dictatorship. The dictator has been Great Britain, the colonial office, the British colonial office. But it's been a benevolent dictatorship. And that's a subject I want to go back on. But it's a fascinating story because at the very time that Britain was embarking on a socialist policy in its homeland, Hong Kong had imposed upon it a complete laissez-faire free market policy. You know, accident plays an enormous role in the affairs of mankind. And it was pure accident that for some reason the British colonial office chose to send to Hong Kong to be its financial secretary a man by the name of John Cowperthwaite, now Sir John, a Scotsman who had been brought up in the land of Adam Smith and who believed that the best thing government could do would be to leave people alone and let them develop their own way. And he became financial secretary of Hong Kong, and he imposed, essentially, he was the representative of the benevolent dictatorship, the benevolent part of it, and he imposed complete free markets. In the process, they set up what comes about as close in economics as we can have to a controlled experiment. Socialism at home, free market capitalism in Hong Kong. And the results are unambiguous. If you look at it in terms of productive efficiency, economic well-being, the outcome is decisive. In 1960, the per capita income of the people of Hong Kong was 1/3 the level of the per capita income of the people in the homeland in Britain. By 1995, the per capita income in Hong Kong was 1/3 higher than the per capita income in Britain. In Britain, you went like this. In Hong Kong, you went like that. It's a remarkable performance, and I think there is no way of denying it. It was not only that Hong Kong did so much better, but it had much less favorable circumstances. A much higher density of population, a much more rapid rate of growth. The population of Hong Kong multiplied tenfold from the end of World War II to 1995, and it multiplied as a result of an inflow of people, of refugees from communist China who came with their hands in their heads, but not much else. And it multiplied, although Hong Kong has no natural resources except a great harbor. So I find it hard to see any counteracting, any other explanation than the difference in the economic models, the economic arrangements that they choose. It's a very, it's really, it's almost, when you say it, it's so outstanding, it's a real miracle, although it's not unique. Singapore, almost as well, not quite. Taiwan, almost as well, not quite. There are many other examples. But when you come to political freedom, Britain ended World War II with a great many colonies to which it gave independence. And when it gave them independence, they also had political freedom. What's happened to them? Most of them have by this time, not all of them, but most of them, have lost their political freedom and have had, and are from an economic point of view, worse off than they were, with a few exceptions. There are some of them that still have political freedom. Perhaps the best example is India. India, very populous country, does have political freedom. They're going to the polls, what is it, next week or a week after next, very soon. It also has a very large measure of human freedom. However, it has very limited economic freedom. India followed the home country, the country of which it had been a colony, Britain. It adopted the socialist welfare state policies of Britain. And in the first 40 years of independence, there was absolutely no significant rise in the standard of life of its people. In the past few years, it has started to deregulate and to privatize, and it has tremendous potential. I think if India could adopt the economic policy of Hong Kong, it would astound the world with its growth. It has productive people, able people, but its adoption of Britain's policies has kept it back. In a way, Britain is another example. It has political freedom. It has a great deal of personal human freedom. However, as the example I gave indicates, it has not done very well economically, despite the Thatcher Revolution, which in retrospect was a good idea in the right direction, but like the Reagan Revolution, was subsequently more or less reversed. But now I ask this question. Suppose communist China had not been there. Then Hong Kong could have been given its independence the same way as the other colonies were. It would have had independence with political freedom. Is there anybody who believes that it would be economically and in human freedom as well off as it is today? I do not believe so. If you just look at the example of all the other colonies, the political freedom would have been used to destroy the economic freedom. What all this suggests is that while economic freedom facilitates political freedom, I think of that there's also a good deal of evidence. Once political freedom is achieved, it tends to move in a direction that tends to destroy economic freedom. I don't say that with any relish. I find that an enormously troubling conclusion. As a citizen of a democracy, I believe in political freedom. I believe that people ought to have the right to vote for who will govern them. Yet, as an observer of history, I find it hard to avoid the conclusion that political freedom may be dangerous to economic and human freedom. You don't have to go anywhere else than this country to see how valid that is. If you compare the situation today in the United States with the situation as it was when I graduated from high school in 1928, a long, long time ago, we were much poorer then in material things. The dishwashers and radars and so on had not yet been invented. But we were fundamentally much freer in human conditions. It was a much more civil society. We weren't afraid to walk the streets at night. We didn't have to lock our doors. We didn't have to fill out those long income tax returns. I didn't have any income then, so it didn't matter. But if I go back and look, if I have been filing income tax returns now for 63 years. And if I have the records of all my income tax returns. And the early ones are 1 or 2 pages, and gradually, year by year, and I now need a whole volume to keep the returns in. By every dimension, we are less free now than people were then. We're less free about what we do with what we earn. Half of our income on the average, roughly, is spent for us by third parties. We are less free in the activities we engage in. We didn't have anything like as much licensing, limitations on what activities you could follow, and so on. But now I want to go back to my main theme. It seems a paradox of the first water that political freedom should be antithetical to human freedom. Yet, if you look at it in a purely theoretical and abstract level, it's easy to explain what seems a paradox. The essence of human freedom is the freedom of people to make their own decisions so long as they don't interfere with the freedom of others. But that makes clear why private markets are so closely related to human freedom. Private markets are the only mechanism that permits a complex, interrelated society to be organized from the bottom up and not from the top down. The comparison between a free market on the one hand and an army on the other brings it out. In a military setting, the general commands, the colonel tells it to the major tells it to the captain, and so on down the line, until the private jumps to attention. In an economic market, it's the other way around. The consumer goes to the store and buys a toothpaste or doesn't, and that order gets sent up the line until it affects what toothpastes are produced and ultimately how they're produced. Those are the only two ways you can organize society, from the bottom up or the top down. We're here in Claremont University, Claremont College, and a university is a good example of what's organized from the bottom up. In this case, it's the teachers up, not the students. But the fact that that's the case, that a free markets, economic freedom depends on cooperation among millions of people, voluntary cooperation, also makes it clear why free markets are so rare, why free societies are so rare. Make no mistake about it. We have been born in a relatively free society and have lived in a free society, and so we take it for granted. But yet there's been no time in history, including the present, when the great majority of the human race has lived in free societies. So free markets are very rare. Free societies are very rare. And the reason it is because they restrain power. Restrain power for both bad people and good people. In a free society, you have to get voluntary cooperation. The consumer is the ultimate boss. And in such a society, bad people find it hard to get what they want, but so do good people. Most interventions in government are not by bad people. Most government interventions are originally made by good people seeking to do good, who know what's good for the population better than they individually do. If they trusted the individual values, they'd let them proceed through a free, voluntary cooperation. But they know that the people are foolish, that they're not going to save enough for their retirement, that they're not going to get the railroads from keep the railroads from charging them too much, and so on. So almost all interventions, not all, perhaps tariffs are a good example of some that are not, but most interventions are from good people who want to do good. But once violence and force is introduced to achieve something, it gets taken over by bad people and becomes an instrument for doing harm. Every regulatory authority, from the Interstate Commerce Commission to the Food and Drug Administration to you name it, has initially, almost everyone has initially been established for good reasons. But once it's established, there's a pot of money there, and people are going to go after it. And the Interstate Commerce Commission is going to come under the control of the railroads. The FDA is going to come under the control of the drug industry, and so on down the line. What this suggests, to put it in more technical economic terms, is that a free society may be an unstable equilibrium position. By chance or otherwise, it can get established. But it's very hard to maintain it, because if you push it, it tends to go in one direction. If you expand government, it tends to stay expanded. The hardest thing in the world is to get something undone. You go back in history and name the government activities that have been closed down, and there are very few and far between. Alcoholic prohibition of alcohol is one example. And there are 2 or 3 other examples, but it's very hard to find cases in which the role of government has been rolled back. You can find many cases where it's been expanded. And the reason is simple, along the same lines. Those activities have come into the hands of people who benefit a good deal from them. And each of those people has a strong interest in keeping it there. On the other hand, the costs are spread broadly among the population at large, and individual citizens don't have an incentive to operate against them. You know, people say that, well, we have majority rule. Really, the difficulty in cutting down government, they say, is that people want all the goodies that government gives. But they don't. That's a bunch of nonsense. Does everybody in this room want to pay twice the world price for sugar? If that were put to a vote, do you think it would be approved by the American people? But Archer Daniel Midlands thinks we ought to pay twice as much for sugar. And we do. So I don't believe it's true for a second that we have so much government because people have such demands upon government. We have so much government because once you get started in an area, it becomes a preserve of the people who can best take advantage of it, and they have a far greater interest in maintaining it than the population at large has in destroying it. The minimum wage rate, which is coming up now, is another very good example. It's there is no doubt that it has the effect of increasing unemployment and making it difficult for people who have very little skill to get hold of the first rung of the ladder. But why do we have it? Because the trade unions benefit greatly from it, and they are the ones who insist on having it. But let me come back to the, this will be more controversial, I'm sure, than my general theme. But I want to add, I hasten to add, this is not an argument for dictatorship. The Hong Kong dictatorship was benevolent because it adopted a laissez-faire policy, a free market policy. But that's very rare. I do not know of any other example of a dictatorship which has adopted that policy. There are many political scientists in this room who know this subject better than I do, and I would appreciate whether they have, telling me whether they have come across any cases, other than this, of dictators who have adopted as completely laissez-faire a policy as was adopted in Hong Kong. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore may be a counterexample, though it's less clear in that case. He was far less self-denying. You know, it's fascinating that both of those relatively benevolent dictators were educated in Britain, the source of our own freedom as ensconced in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But benevolent dictators are few and far between, and there is no mechanism to guarantee that their successors will also be benevolent. So I'm not arguing for dictatorship. I'm just arguing for facing clearly up to the problems of maintaining a free society, of what seems like a force, like a strong element of instability which tends to destroy a free society. We'll have some more evidence in the next decade of what happens when a country is handed over to another dictator. When you move from the benevolent dictatorship that Hong Kong has enjoyed to the dictatorship that is present in China. And I think that too will be a fascinating controlled experiment. I wish I were more optimistic than I am about what will happen there, but I am not very optimistic. But let me close on a slightly more optimistic note. More than 200 years ago, an English newspaper wrote, and I quote, "There are 775,300,000 people in the world. Of these, arbitrary governments command 741,800,000, and the free ones only 33.5 million. On the whole, slaves are 3 and 20 times more numerous than men enjoying in any tolerable degree the rights of human nature." That was 200 years ago. 23 to 1, slaves to free men. I haven't seen any authoritative or precise estimate for the present, but I made a rough estimate myself a few years ago based on the various studies that have been made of political and human freedom. And I concluded that while slaves still greatly outnumber free men, the ratio has fallen in the past 2 centuries from 23 to 1 to less than 3 to 1. We're still far from our goal of a completely free world, but on the scale of historical time, that is amazing progress, more in 2 centuries than in the previous 2 millennia. And the issue it raises, and now I come back to my main theme, is what's wrong with my analysis? If my analysis were correct, should it have gone the other way? And that is the most optimistic thing I can think of, that I am wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman, for your talk. At this time, I will take questions from the floor. Student questions will come first, others after. If you do have a question, please come up to one of 2 microphones located down both of the aisles. And just a reminder that questions should be brief and to the point.
Dr. Friedman, how
Yeah.
do you propose to shed some light on the tension between, I guess, economic freedom, political freedom, and also non-marketable values, such as, a whole sort of things as in,
Such what?
non-marketable values, such as things as, basic human kindness, better environment, things like that, which tends to not be factored into any kind of laissez-faire type system.
I didn't get the last part of your question.
Basically, how do you deal with, could you
But I understand what you're asking about values that you regard as non-marketable, such as friendship, kindness, etc. But what's the question about them?
Well, it seems like most of the, at least if you take an economic view on it, that the way, for example, our society right now is a lot more consumerism driven than it is otherwise.
Not at all. On the contrary. Our society is half non-consumer driven. Half the national income is spent on our behalf by someone else, by governments. It's determined what shall be done. I believe that there's a great misconception that underlies your question, which is that somehow market arrangements tend to be dehumanizing, tend to be materialistic. That's utterly wrong. I'll tell you how to see that. You go into a store to buy something and see how the person serving you treats you. Go to a restaurant to get a meal where you are the customer and they're treating you. And then go into a restaurant in a totalitarian country, or for that matter, go to your school lunchroom here. In which case do you get more friendly, gentle treatment? If you're serving a customer, you have to be nice to him. The case of medicine is an overwhelming point. When medicine was a strictly private activity, there was a much closer relation between patients and physicians than there is when medicine is distributed in a more depersonalized way. So I believe that there has been a serious decline in the United States in civility. And while that cannot be attributed entirely to the growth of government, I believe a large part of the decline in civility comes from the increasing role of government. I don't get the same kind of civil treatment from my IRS auditor that I get from a bank clerk.
Dr. Friedman, first of all, I want to thank you for crystallizing so many years ago my socioeconomic philosophy. My question is, were you at one time in favor of indexing the benefits for Social Security, and if so, why?
I believe that government is responsible for inflation. There's only one place inflation is made, that's in Washington. And as a result, I think it is right that with respect to any governmental activities, they should be indexed. They should be adjusted for inflation. That applies to the tax rates, to the indexing of the personal income tax. It applies to the indexing of Social Security benefits and so on. Now, I suspect your question has to do with private arrangements for indexing.
Well, I'm worried that you would shield one segment of society from inflation, that you would shield one segment of society from inflation, the elderly who collect Social Security, but not allow for protection for the remainder of society.
Well, I would like to shield everybody from inflation by having government follow a policy which does not produce inflation. But let me give you a very simple example there. The greatest Ponzi scheme has, in the last 50 years, was government issuing of debt at interest rates which turned out to be less than the inflation rate. Every Secretary of the Treasury for decades pleaded with the American people to buy U.S. savings bonds and told them they were good savings vehicles and they would benefit themselves by buying it, when every Secretary of the Treasury knew that that wasn't the case. Those people who bought savings bonds before the inflation ended up with securities which had less purchasing power when they turned them in than they had when they started. They got a negative rate of return. I think that was unfair and inequitable, and therefore I would like to see government issue its securities, its bonds, only on the basis of being fully indexed, of purchasing power securities. So similarly, so far as a private society, private arrangements are concerned, there's nothing to prevent people from entering into indexing agreements, and they have. So I really don't believe that by indexing those things that government is involved in, I am preventing other people, I'm doing any harm to other people. Non-indexing of the income tax system is largely responsible for the high level of government spending today. I remember many years ago, you know, inflation doesn't assume the role today that it did in the 1970s and 80s. That was a period when inflation rates went up to 10, 15% per year. And it was at during that period that I remember once having breakfast in Washington with Senator Long of Louisiana. And he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And I remember one statement he made. He said, you know, we never could have enacted the present rates of tax on the levels of income to which they now apply. We never could have done that. But when those rates of tax were first adopted, they only applied to relatively high incomes. But because the tax system wasn't indexed, you had what was called tax creep. A tax rate which initially applied, let's say, to the top 10% of the population. As inflation went along, a larger and larger fraction of the population got above that level. And ultimately, it got applied to people at very low and moderate levels. And as Long said, they never could have enacted that in Congress. So I think the avoidance of that kind of event is very desirable.
Dr. Friedman, I want to ask a question. Which system do you think will be working better for China? Benevolent dictatorship which regulates the economy, or laissez-faire economic system like Hong Kong? Thank you.
Well, China is a very difficult case. You know, unfortunately, you're starting with a dictatorship. And the dictatorship has not been entirely benevolent by any manner of means. There's no way you can impose it. That's the trouble with dictatorship. There's no way you can choose to have a benevolent dictatorship instead of a non-benevolent one. I have no doubt that what's going on in China, and this is not what's good or bad, but what will happen, is that as there has been a very rapid economic development. It's changed drastically. My wife and I have had the privilege of visiting China 3 times, in 1980, 1988, 1992. And each time, there was no doubt that in places we saw there was a very much greater measure of economic activity and advance. But and there's no doubt that that development threatened the dictatorship, that it gave the expansion of the area which was in the market enabled the people within that area to have more liberty and more freedom than they had before. That was the ultimate source of Tiananmen Square, of the attempt by the dictatorship to clamp down. Now, that event was one event, but it won't be the last such event. If China continues on this path of broadening the market area, you will have further political conflicts of that kind, and you will have further events. What will be best for China would be if it could move in the direction of a free market and a free system. And it may very well do so. I trust that it will. But I don't know really how to answer your question. I'm not going to set out to try to write a blueprint for what China should do. That's beyond even my capacities.
Thank you.
You mentioned that a increased minimum wage would be detrimental to employment.
Sure.
But wouldn't a increased minimum wage, because seeing that it's currently below the poverty line, I guess you could say, wouldn't an increased minimum wage increase the lower class? And wouldn't a lower class be better than a smaller middle class, a greater lower
I don't
class?
understand you. The one thing that a minimum wage would do would be to reduce the number of people who receive a positive income from working. Those people who were kept in employment would have a higher income. But let me look at it a different way. Look at it from an overall point of view. Higher minimum wage will lead to people being unemployed. I think everybody will agree on that. All people say is, oh, well, the number would be small, and that's offset by the advantage of those who are still employed. However, by decreasing the number employed, do you increase or decrease the total pie? Do you have more to distribute to everybody in the country if more people are employed or if fewer people are employed? Obviously, you have more to distribute if more people are employed. They produce more. These unemployed people, these low-income wage people who are driven into unemployment by a rise in the minimum wage don't produce what they otherwise would have produced. So the total pie is smaller. Now, how can that on net be an advantage? There's a great deal of nonsense talked about the minimum wage. And every time people ask the obvious question, if raising the minimum wage from $4.25 to $5.15 is a good idea, why not to $10? Why are you so mean and nasty that you don't want people to have $10 now? It's countered by saying, oh, well, a little is good, but a lot would be bad. Now, I don't understand the logic of that. If a lot is bad, then there's a little that's bad. It's all in the same direction. It doesn't change direction. And the people who are employed at the minimum wage today are predominantly teenagers, secondary earners, people who are working part-time. It's a very small fraction of the population that's employed at the low wage. Why do we have a minimum wage? I shouldn't say that. What maintains a minimum wage? Why is it that this general interest that I'm talking about is overcome by the special interest? It's very easy to see. The trade unions want to reduce the amount of competition. We have a minimum wage for the same reason we have tariffs, an attempt to reduce competition. And that interest is concentrated politically powerful, the interest of these poor suckers at the bottom who are going to lose their jobs. They don't have much political power, and they can't counter on it. And by using this high-sounding language, the trade union people get people like you, who have the best of intentions, to support their special interest.
Thank you.
Dr. Friedman?
Yes.
You asserted that you are significantly less free today than you were in the halcyon year of 1928. I have two questions for you. The first is, how free would you say the average black American was in 1928 by comparison to today? And the second question is, how do you think you would have been treated if you had attempted to, say, burn a flag in 1928?
What?
If you had attempted to burn a flag in 1928?
I don't know about burning a flag. So far as the blacks are concerned, as a problem of race is concerned, that was, of course, a very real problem and a disaster, a very troubling problem in 1928. But it'd be kind of interesting for you to look at the statistics a little before you come to your rough conclusions. The unemployment rate among blacks in 1928, if I remember the figures, was lower than among whites, not higher. And that's a big change from then to now. There was an enormous amount of race prejudice. Don't misunderstand me. And it's a very good thing that that has declined. I don't question that. I think that, you see, so far as the thing people emphasize, Brown versus Board of Education, the fundamental problem is that the states were running the schools. And it was government prejudice that was operating. It was prejudice acting through government. If you had then, as you ought to have now, a strictly private school system, you would not have had the kinds of problems that arose under the government school system. You would have had some schools that were all black, some that were all white, and some mixed. So I'm not prepared to say that taking all things in all, if you had been able to continue with remember, we've had tremendous changes in many areas over that time, particularly in the areas that have been affected by technology. We are much more wealthier than we were then. And really, it's a miracle of a capitalist system that despite the fact that the state eats up, the government uses half the income, what's left is enough to provide us with all the amenities we have now. That's a very much underappreciated phenomenon. But I'm not so sure your two exceptions are as... I'll tell you the one respect in which I was worse off then. Anti-Semitism was much worse then than it is now. But I don't attribute the reduction in anti-Semitism to government action. I attribute it to the action of Hitler. And it would have been better if that hadn't happened.
Good evening, Dr. Friedman. I was curious. You mentioned that crime has increased and it's become unsafer since you were a youth. Is there any economic policy that you could suggest that might decrease the crime rate?
It might reduce?
Decrease the crime rate.
Decrease? I'm sorry. Crime rate? Oh, yeah, sure. I'll be glad to suggest how to decrease the crime rate. Well, I thought you were going to ask a hard question. The one action that would do more to reduce the crime rate than any other would be to end the prohibition, the so-called war on drugs. I investigated the incidence of homicides during the period of alcohol prohibition and after the period of alcohol prohibition. And then subsequently, during the period when the laws which were on the books against so-called drugs were not enforced, and then after Mr. Nixon revived the so-called war on drugs in 1972. And if you look at the statistics of homicides per person and so on, they declined sharply after alcohol prohibition was ended, after 1934. They then stay right down there, more or less, on through to 68 and then start going up, or 72, and then start going up. And I estimated that the so-called war on drugs was leading to about 10,000 additional homicides a year. Roughly half of the people who are fill our overfull jails are in there for drug-related crimes. Whatever, I happen to be opposed to prohibition of drugs on moral and ethical grounds as well as on practical grounds. I do not believe that the government should have the power to tell me what I may ingest. If they tell me that I may not ingest cocaine, which I have never done as it happens, but if they tell me I may not ingest cocaine, the next step is they're going to tell me I may not ingest fattening foods. Why not? What's the logical difference? If it's for the benefit of the greater number, that people should not have access to cocaine, why isn't it for the benefit of the greater numbers that we reduce all the obesity we see? And the way to do that is to prohibit what people ingest. At any rate, you may not agree with that. You may believe that it is ethically justified for the government to prevent the usage of these particular things called drugs. But if so, just look at the actual consequences. The war on drugs has been an utter failure. I think nobody can deny that. You've spent billions and billions of dollars. You've thrown millions of people into jails. You've corrupted the police force, the law enforcement. You've tended to inflict damage on human freedom by government takeovers of property without due process, by government invading people's houses without appropriate process, and so on. And what have you got for it? On a moral basis, the worst feature of the drug war, in my opinion, is what it's done to other countries. How can anybody in this room justify the United States imposing thousands of deaths and political instability upon Colombia because we cannot enforce our laws? If we could enforce the law against the consumption of these drugs, there'd be no cartel, no Cali cartel. There'd be no market for them. But we can't enforce our own laws, and so we impose the costs somewhere else. How can you justify that on a moral ground? On a practical ground, there's no question. There are far more deaths from tobacco smoking than there are from cocaine or crack or all the other things you think of. In 2,000 years, there's no recorded case of a death from an overdose of marijuana. Marijuana is potentially useful for medical purposes, for glaucoma, for nausea and so on. But you can't have research on it. You can't distribute it. Physicians can't prescribe it for those purposes. Anybody who is in favor of the prohibition of drugs should be in favor of the restoration of alcohol prohibition and of the prohibition of tobacco smoking. Whatever argument you can make for the existing catalog of illegal drugs, you can make for tobacco and alcohol. It's illogically incoherent. And so there's no doubt in my mind that that's step number one that would tend to reduce the crime rate. And step number two, which is more important on some levels and less important on others, would be privatizing the school system. From that point of view, the step I've been in favor of is free parental choice of schools through vouchers. But privatizing, one of the reasons we have a high crime rate is because our schools do such a lousy job, particularly in the center cities, which are the generators of much of the crime. And that has the effect of producing kids who can't get jobs, who are not economically able to support themselves. And dealing in drugs, robbery, and so on become very, very very good alternatives for the use of their time. Well, these are complicated and long subjects, I've just been very dogmatic, and I hope you will realize that I am being dogmatic just in order to conserve time.
Dr. Friedman, I'd like your opinion on what it would take to privatize the Social Security system, at least to the same level that it's privatized in Chile now.
Sure, I'd be glad to. The question is, as you heard, privatizing Social Security. Again, Social Security is a wonderful case. It consists of two elements, neither of which anybody would be in favor of. But you put them together and they become a sacred cow. One element, I ask you, if anybody in this room would consider voting for a tax on the first dollar of wages up to a maximum, would anybody believe that was a good tax? It's about 15% now of wages, beginning with the first dollar, but there's a limit. If you have a high enough wage, the tax doesn't get any larger. Anybody in favor of that regressive a tax? Anybody in favor of a benefit system under which the amount people receive, we're going to give them welfare, we're going to give them welfare checks, and the amount you get depends on how much you have earned. So if you've been a very high earner, you get a large subsidy from the government. If you've been a low earner, you get a low subsidy from the government. Anybody in favor of that? Put the two together and you have our Social Security system. That's an accurate description of it. In 1972, a long time ago, I had a public debate with Wilbur Cohn, who was at that time the head of the Social Security system, in which I proposed privatizing Social Security, and I outlined a series of measures which combined would overnight privatize Social Security. I could give you a list of those measures, but let me say they exist. It's perfectly straightforward. The general principle is that you take unfunded obligations and fund them. You say to every individual, for those over 65 who are now receiving Social Security, just continue. Just let them grow out of the system and keep the present system. But if they want to get out, that's all right. If they want to get freed from it, you give them government securities equal in value to the present value of what they're going to be entitled to in the way of benefits. And similarly, anybody who has accumulated enough Social Security taxes, payments, so-called, Social Security, I'm not saying that right. Anybody who has had enough work to become eligible for benefits, you give him the alternative. He can continue on the present system, or he can take the present value of what his future benefits would be in a lump sum. And he can deposit it handle it in any way he wants. And for those people who have not yet become eligible, you buy them off by giving them back what they've put in taxes. And say, from here on, you're on your own. The way they did in Chile, was to add to it, to my scheme. What they did in Chile was essentially what I proposed, except they added to it a government requirement that people had to use at least, I think it was 10% of their wages for retirement purposes. I don't see why people shouldn't be free to use their money as they want. Tell me, why is it ethical that I have a man who has incurable cancer, but he's employed and he's required to put aside 15% of his income for his retirement? Does that make any sense? I don't think so. Anyway, let me go back to the privatization question, try to answer that in full. You will say to me, and this is the main argument, but how are you going to afford to give all those benefits? Where's the money going to come from? Those obligations are there today, except they're not funded. The so-called national debt is grossly understated because it only includes the funded parts of the national debt. But there's a large unfunded part, the pensions for government employees, railroad retirement benefits, Social Security benefits. There's a, what is it, $3 or $4 trillion unfunded benefits. And all you're doing is funding it. You're converting it from an unfunded state to a funded state. So I don't think there'd be any problem in financing it.
Dr. Friedman, I'm an econ major, but I'll be honest, I'm currently in the dark about a lot of the plans to revamp the current tax code.
About what?
To revamp the current tax code, the plans on the Hill. What plans would you suggest for revamping the tax code?
Very simple. The first thing to do is to eliminate the IRS. The second thing to do is to reestablish a much smaller IRS, which will impose a flat rate tax on all income above an exemption, with no deductions whatsoever for anything, on income from all sources, whether from wages, from interest, from dividends, or from anything else. Eliminate the corporate income tax, but require corporations to attribute all of their income to individuals, and require individuals to include it on their personal income tax, personal tax returns. That would give you a very much simpler system. It would raise as much revenue as the present corporate and personal income tax do, with a flat rate of somewhere around 17 to 20%. I'm not sure just where. That would be, in broad outlines, the kind of way I would revamp the tax system.
This will be our last question.
Good.
Pressure's on me. Dr. Friedman, in your speech, you said something about the Hong Kong government providing public housing to immigrants. Could you please comment on the U.S. policy on immigration? If we were to make our borders truly free or open, would the huge influx in immigrants from Mexico have adverse, perhaps devastating effect on the American economy and society?
That's a very good question and a very difficult question. Until now, it's always been interesting to me. I want to ask you people two questions. Number one, was it a good thing that before 1914 the U.S. had completely open immigration, no restrictions whatsoever? Was it a good thing, yes or no? Yes. Would it be a good thing today to have completely open immigration? That shows the difficulty of the problem. Why the difference? Because we are now a welfare state. In a welfare state, you cannot have, unfortunately, free immigration. I'd like to have free immigration. I am the son of immigrants, of course. My wife is herself an immigrant at a tender age. So free immigration is what you would like to have, but you cannot have it in conjunction with a welfare state. Because in a welfare state, you are going to have people come not because they're going to contribute, not because they're going to be productive and so on, but because they are going to get benefits which they could otherwise not get. So that I am torn about, I don't have any good way to answer this question. I think many of the things we do now are kind of silly, and particularly with respect to Mexico. Very few people realize that until something like, I think it was in the 1960s, we had a completely open border with Mexico. There were no restrictions on Mexico's coming in or going out. And they came in a seasonal movement. They came in to harvest the crops, and they went back home with their earnings. And that was a very healthy thing for both sides. So with respect to this question, I cannot really say what I would like to say, which is that I am in favor today of completely open borders, because I don't think that's feasible. On the other hand, it seems to me just inexcusable to have these high metal walls between Mexico and the United States, to have this spectacle of American Gestapo people out at night with night binoculars looking for those poor, ignorant Mexicans who are trying to come into this paradise. It just seems to me humanly revolting to see that kind of a spectacle. And I believe we can have much more generous immigration from Mexico into the United States with very little, if any, harm to our society and with maybe some benefit. On the other hand, I can't really come out and say we should have completely free and open immigration from everywhere in the world. Okay. Thank you.